So, again, just to give ourselves a break from the day transition, let's just start to find a comfortable position with the body. So, keeping our feet flat and our back straight, and then just try to have a sense of pulling the awareness away from the environment, from the outside world, and moving that awareness into the body and mind. And then just start to use the physical sensation of the breath as it passes into and back out of the tip of the nostrils as a way of anchoring your attention in the present. And just try to keep coming back to that present moment, physical sensation, breathing naturally, breathing normally, and just again and again letting go of distraction, coming back to that present moment physical sensation. A motivation where we think about others, thinking that our efforts and our interest isn't for our own benefit alone, but also that we want to find ways of being able to benefit those around us. So we just establish a broad, virtuous motivation. All right. So good afternoon, happy Friday. Welcome back, or if you're here for the first time, welcome. So these classes are recorded and they are on Tibetan Ling's YouTube page if you're just tuning in, or if maybe you've missed one. It's an 8-week course and this is week 4, so we'll be halfway done when we're finished today. So and I do have there will be a meditation that I'll put in the chat when we get to the end of the class for people to have. It will also within a day or 2 or 3, it'll be in that materials link on the website as well, where you can find it there for the class. There's a materials link for this class. It'll be there. I don't believe it's there now, but it will be there shortly. So as I normally do, the very first thing to ask or to check in with people is just from last week, since there was that meditation that was given, and since people may have in some way reflected or thought about what we did talk about? Did anyone come to class with a thought or a question or something that they wanted to address with respect to any of that before we moved on? No? Okay, no problem. So the thing that we ran out of time last week. At the end, I had thought maybe we'd get to the section where Lama Yeshe talks about anger, but we didn't quite get to that. So, and that's quite good, that we have a good chunk of time to start thinking about this, because it is, I mean, this as a topic, I think it's a topic that you could really explore for, I mean, of course, if we think of the material, if we think of these ideas as, things for us to start to implement in daily life, then this is something, of course, that we will be exploring every day for the rest of our lives. But more just in terms of what Buddhism has to say about the topic of anger, just philosophically, is something that you could really spend an incredible amount of time thinking and looking at and exploring in a lot of really, really detailed ways. So it is, I think, a really important and interesting um, topic, and important important also because it there's differences, um, in terms of, I would say, Western society, our kind of modern society, materialistic society, and how people want to, or how people have been inculcated or sort of raised it to think about these things is different than how we might be encouraged to maybe start thinking about these things. Um, so, sorry, so many windows. So here, Lama Yeshe says, and it's been pointed out by Venerable Rabina and so many other teachers, that attachment, which is really attachment, of course, is the touchstone for the Course, the thing that will, this sort of exaggerated frame of mind that we will keep coming back to. But what Lama Yeshe says here is that because of this energy of attachment, we have the foundation is kind of already laid in the mind for the arising of anger. Um, and so, but of course, right off the bat, we really do need to look at the word itself and what we mean when we say anger. And things really do go to very nuanced levels, and you'll need, someone like Geshe Sherab to do a much better job, of helping you look at that than I can do. But we, when we say anger, the English word, in a way, in some ways, doesn't quite always get at what the Buddhist use of the word is getting at. And that's something that can cause difficulty, for us. When we hear that anger, we may have heard that anger is one of the three root delusions or root poisons, along with attachment. Um, And so I mentioned last week, I recommended when we were talking about looking at how how our ego identity presents itself to us and how that happens at in different ways at different times, and how by checking in with how our ego identity is presenting itself, we can get an insight into ways in which we can hold our identity more gently, not so tightly, not so concretely. And I recommended for anyone who might be interested, His Holiness's book, How to See Yourself as You Really Are. On this topic, His Holiness, of course, has a different book that's also really good. Um, I think it's been published under different titles, I think. It's Perfecting Patience, I think, is the re release of Healing Anger. I believe that they're the same book. I could be wrong, but so Healing Anger or Perfecting Patience is his book on this topic. Again, if if you were really motivated to start maybe doing some reading, some exploration of these ideas, that's where it's a great place to start. So what he points out very early on in that book is that when Buddhism is talking about this, there's an element of the way that they define it, or the element that they bring to it, is that there's a wish to cause some harm, with respect to this idea of anger. And so His Holiness, in that book, does make a distinction between the mind that observes a situation and feels that the situation is really intolerable, that the situation is really just something that must change. That, he says, sometimes can be experienced in a way that isn't quite this sort of wish to cause harm. But as I was, saying, as I was mentioning, it also kind of in a way depends on how do we want to think about this? How, because there is, I feel like, and other texts and other presentations would suggest perhaps that there is still a danger that that can kind of easily transition into the wish to cause harm. So it is, we do have to, in a way, distinguish, but at the same time, I think we can also try to recognize that one can and maybe often does transition into the other, where we see that there's harm in the world, and recognizing that there's harm in the world, and giving rise to that sense of feeling like it must change, that if we allow that to transition into then feeling like the people that we are holding responsible for that harm need to come to some harm, that's when we've started to give into anger. That's when we've started to transition away from just a more clear, even-minded appraisal of the situation and feeling as though, okay, this is really a destructive situation that I really feel like if there's something I can do, I should do. That kind of energy sometimes can give rise to othering, and can sometimes give rise to a sense of conflating perhaps the legitimate observation, that there are people who are engaging in destructive actions in the world, but then conflating those tendencies, those actions, those behaviors with the essence of the people engaging in those behaviors, those actions, and not having the spaciousness, the wisdom, the even mindedness that can separate those things. So, we can start to see how this is such a nuanced, subtle topic, and that we very much want to hold on to that idea of feeling that indignation and feeling that sense of, things must be different. But the trouble is, so that, of course, that's one aspect of what the trouble is that it can shift and we can lose control over that energy. It can take over, and we may lose the ability to rein it in and use it constructively. But then also, what Lama Yeshe says here is that what he says, what happens is that we leave an imprint in our mind to respond to that situation in the same way again in the future. So this is another aspect of what's problematic, is that there's a process of generalizing that can happen. We start out thinking, okay, well, in these situations, under these circumstances, I will indulge in this way of behaving, this way of thinking, because I feel like there are certain boundaries, certain norms, certain expectations that are being violated, and so I'm going to respond this way. But then, over time, that imprint, that tendency, that habit will start finding other scenarios, other times, other situations where there's boundaries that are being trampled on, but those boundaries might start to become less and less objectively, in a way, valid. In a way, because of course, when there's real harm in the world, of course, that's a very valid boundary. But when there's an inconvenience to ourselves, that's something that we would prefer not happen. We would prefer never being inconvenienced. We would prefer never being separated from something that we find pleasant. And the trouble is, one aspect of this is that the more that we habituate to this way of thinking, the greater the likelihood is that we will start to generalize that reactive approach to a whole variety of other circumstances where there isn't that really sensible, really valid boundary. And so, Buddhism might be suggesting that we could start to investigate, start to look at, is there another way of looking at circumstances to motivate my actions, my behaviors? And what Buddhism is suggesting here is that it's sufficient to familiarize the mind with love and compassion, and to use those principles as a way of navigating. Um, and so when we do that in an impartial way, in a very broad way, then when we observe some boundary that's being violated, we recognize that yes, one part of that equation is that someone's being harmed, and so we feel compassion and love for the person being harmed. Another aspect of that equation is that someone's perpetrating that harm. And from but with this way of thinking, we're able more and more over time in increasingly complex and difficult situations and scenarios to also cultivate a sense of love and compassion for that person, recognizing that they are creating harm because of the obscurations that exist in their own mind. That they, just like us, deeply wish to be happy and to be free of suffering. And just like us, they have mistaken ways of going about that. Perhaps they have a much more mistaken or a much more harmful way of doing that than what we have been or are in the process of being able to do. And yet, it's still the same process. So, and we of course recognize that the seeds of that are also in our own mind, and that we also get angry at people, we also lash out, we also act in unskillful ways. So that sense of othering, that sense of feeling that this person is in the nature of their mistaken actions is reduced, is something that we do less of and we do less intensely. And Buddhism would suggest that the same outcome, what we want to do ultimately, of course, is to resolve that situation well. That was our goal. And what Buddhism is suggesting is that our habituation to anger is actually preventing us from achieving what we want, from achieving that goal of resolving this situation, either a situation that we're a part of or a situation that we're observing. It's preventing us from actually bringing that resolution because we lack, when that mind is arising, we lack the clarity and the spaciousness and the even-mindedness to actually bring about a resolution to that, to be able to constructively work toward a good result in that scenario, because we're caught up in this, you could say, destructive or unskillful way of relating. And so the extent to which we can learn to view that whole process through understanding that a sentient being is being deprived of happiness and is experiencing a suffering, and the extent to which we are only motivated to work toward relieving that suffering and providing that sense of happiness. We don't need, Buddhism would suggest, we don't need this energy of, creating distance and creating a sense of the sort of more vindictive or the more punishing or the more kind of that sort of that energy of anger, we feel like it is necessary to bring about that result. And Buddhism says actually the truth is it's an obstacle to bringing about that result of a good resolution. So if we learn a different way of relating to that scenario, we'll actually be successful in bringing about that result. Um, but this is, in our society, we're really not particularly encouraged to think like that. We're really not, you know, we really feel as though we need that sense of indignation in order to bring about that resolution. And Buddhism would say that we're really just confused about what tools we need to bring to bear on that situation to get a good result. Any thoughts or questions so far?
Venerable Dondrub,
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. Um, this teaching is so timely for me, so I really appreciate it. Thank you. And when you were talking, my mind went to the storming of our capital. And I guess the question that comes up for me is, where does accountability, or does accountability come into the Buddhist equation? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, of course, I mean, there's so many different ways that we can approach that. One is, I think, to recognize that the only thing that we ever control, the only thing that we ever have any possibility of developing or cultivating or, you know, it is our own mind, right? So it is true that we recognize people in our environment that are engaging in all kinds of destructive actions, but we have no ability to transform that experience for them. So, of course, it's true that, we do have to live in a society with laws and a society, that keeps a certain degree of order, and that some people can't participate in society for periods of time and perhaps forever because they're just, their minds are just such that they're not able to do that. And so it isn't to say that we just have to permit, that we have to permit ourselves to be trampled on, or that we have to permit other people to be trampled on. If there is an action that we can do because we see a harm, Buddhism isn't suggesting not to engage in an action, but while we're engaging in an action, what are we doing with our mind? How are we holding our mind as we're engaging in an action? If we're able to see the situation clearly and recognize that these people, to use your example, when people are misled, by people in authority for years and years and years, people that they trust, people that they believe in, and when that is abused, that process, we're all subject to that process. That could happen to us. It's not happening to us right now. It's happening to other people, but it's a very reasonable result of a complex, dependent, arising situation that's occurring. And so it's about, of course, we may have to recognize that yes, sometimes people need to experience a certain consequence in order to learn, how to more constructively engage in society. But we shouldn't be gleeful about it. We shouldn't be like, oh, I hope that some really, we should hope that, that these people, that whoever, whatever the situation, we should hope, well, yes, I hope that they stop hurting people, but we should hope that that happens spontaneously. We should hope that that happens just because they deeply realize or recognize that their actions are bringing about harm. So we shouldn't hope that they only get there because they're punished into getting there, and that because that they've been so beaten down by being imprisoned, that we should hope that they just have a change of heart spontaneously without any negative consequence to themselves. That they just, just like in our own experience, when we get angry at someone, we're capable of thinking about it and reflecting on it and seeing that we caused harm and then changing and being different in the future and learning to not do that again. We should start by hoping that that's what happens for other people who are engaging in destructive actions. But really, the point is to recognize that we're all the same and that we've engaged in for one, we're engaging in these sorts of things on a lesser scale all of the time. It's not as extreme, but the seed of it is the same. So we're not different from them. They're not evil people out there that are separate from me. We're all the same. And they're just maybe more familiar or they have fewer skills to cope in various ways, um, but that they're not some sort of alien that is comprised of evil, um, that we and they are identical, and it's just very, very surface level circumstances that are different. And if our life had been different, we may be doing exactly what they're doing. If we had a different environment or education, what have you, in this very lifetime, our behaviors might be like their behaviors. So it's really just about not wanting anyone to come to harm, um, but at the same time, of course, recognizing that there are times when certain behaviors have to be constrained, um, in order for society to function, in order for people, in order for order in society. And there does have to be a certain amount of enforcement of laws. But as we're trying to enforce the laws, we try to do it without any malice, without any, you know, just really focusing on, I hope that there's a real transformation that happens in their mind where they stop causing harm. Any other, any other thoughts or questions?
Thank you, Venerable Dondrub. That was helpful for me. Thank you.
So he goes on to say again that this process is really one, in large part, has a lot to do with the stories that we tell ourselves. And so we can, to go along with this idea of cultivating love and compassion, that's, of course, one way of getting at how to reframe what we're observing. Instead of focusing on this person out here is doing this to me, or they're doing this to this other person. What other stories, what other ways of explaining what's happening can we start to become familiar with? Um, for example, we can think, you know, instead of one story that we usually go to is, well, this person is always like this. Um, but we can tell ourselves, well, maybe they're just having a really bad day. Um, or maybe there's some circumstance that I don't know about, and that they just right now, they don't have the kind of mental reserves, the kind of, space in their own mind to avoid acting in a way that I'm having trouble with. Maybe they also experienced abuse, they also experienced, or, you know, they just got really terrible news. Could be all kinds of things. The first thing that we go to is, well, they did it intentionally, and they did it out of a sense of malice, or they did it out of a sense of intentional disregard. So, can we start to tell ourselves a story? And we don't know that that's true. The point is, we really don't know if our interpretations are true. And so we're free to tell ourselves a different story. We're free because we don't have access to that person's mind. We're not clairvoyant. We don't actually know what's happening in their mind. We're asserting a motivation, we're asserting some story, and it's usually an extreme, story that allows us to blame them and to not take any responsibility and to feel like we don't need to address this, and that it's appropriate to just push this away. But that's a painful story for ourselves. That gives rise to our own discontent, and it damages what could be a more compassionate interaction. So, can we, because if we recognize, well, I don't really know what's happening here, and so it's equally valid to say, well, they're having a bad day, or, you know, they're just, the person didn't cut me off in traffic because they're inconsiderate, they didn't see me. Um, I also sometimes don't see the person that when I'm changing lanes, I also sometimes don't see that person. Or when I'm really upset about something, I also don't have the kind of mental space to deal with stress in a really constructive way. So this person might also be upset about something and might also not be able to deal with this stress. So, can we find ways that are equally perhaps valid of interpreting the situation in a way that will reduce the anger, that will reduce this sense of separation and this sense of othering? Um, so that's just trying to think about that and trying to find ways of reinterpreting. Um, and even if we are really pretty confident, that this person is like this a lot, maybe we know a person really well, and we know that they are quick-tempered, and so we kind of still, we're telling ourselves a story that they ought to be able to always be different than that. The story is that we kind of have a moralistic expectation that they should just be able to not be like that. But again, that is not tapping into wanting them to be free of suffering and wanting them to have happiness. That is a way of distancing, and that's a way of choosing to conflate their essence with their actions. Um, and so that's also a story that we might feel is really valid and really justified based on repeated experience, but still, there is, even in that situation, a way of finding a different interpretation. The interpretation of, what can I do that might help them to work on these things, rather than I just have an expectation that they ought to be better at working on these things. So here, this is again, from Lama Yeshe. So again, this idea of interpretation is also going along with this word that he uses, hallucinatingly conclude, where, where we don't know what's happening. We don't know why people are doing the things that they do, because we don't have access to their mind. But we assert, we superimpose, we, from our own side, we just ascribe a motivation. And then we think that it's all on that person. We think it's all out there, separate from me, and I bear no responsibility for trying to choose a more compassionate path, for trying to work on my mind and do something. And so, yeah, that's just going along with, there's always stories involved. And so instead of always going to the one that gives rise to our own delusions, can we start to go to ones that give rise to good qualities? Can we start to go to the ones that help us to tap into our potential for growth and development? So the last thing, the next kind of major topic, and so we'll kind of end with this way of framing things, and then we'll pick this up again next week, is what we are looking at here is that when we talk about anger and we talk about these things, we feel like the default perspective is that, and a lot of like secular humanists and things who want to um, kind of rescue this energy of anger. And I'm not, maybe maybe I'm being a little bit too Buddhist in my way of thinking here. I don't know, but people really cling to that idea of anger. But um, it there is a perspective that that we that anger is this intrinsic part of the mind, intrinsic part of our identity, and that the only way of responding to it is suppression, is sublimation, is kind of white knuckling our way through it. And people make that mistake a lot about what Buddhism has to say about this topic. And what I would say, and what many people have pointed out, it's not new, I'm not coming up with it, it's been observed by all of the great Buddhist thinkers, that what Buddhism is really suggesting that we do are awareness and transformation. So it isn't that we just sublimate or suppress anger. We try to become aware of it, and then we try to work with it and transform it into something more constructive, something where we deeply understand all of the causes and the conditions that give rise to it, and then we can start to understand what are those pieces that I can look at or think about in a new way, in a different way, where I can free myself from that habit, from that tendency, because I recognize that that habit and that tendency is causing me to suffer, and it's causing me to cause suffering for others. And I don't want to suffer, and I don't want to cause suffering for others. So here the word dharma, I'm sure almost everyone is familiar with the word dharma, and people use it. It's used colloquially to mean the collected teachings of the Buddha. The word itself, has a more technical. Of course, it has many different meanings in different contexts. It has many meanings, um, but the root, kind of the Sanskrit root, can mean like to uphold, um, or to uphold or to hold back or to support. So there are what we could say there are worldly dharmas, and here we mean the holy dharma. So the holy dharma, in a conventional way, are the teachings of the Buddha, but in a general way, it is what is it that genuinely, truly will hold me back from suffering and will support a, a really valid, true, genuine path of inner growth, inner strength, inner development, inner resilience. Um, and so, this idea, all of these ideas are not, he goes into this whole section that we'll look at where, what he's pointing out is that Buddhism isn't saying you have to do this, you must not do this, that these are, like a series of proscriptive rules that are just external and are being superimposed. All of these concepts and all of these ideas are things to start just investigating in our own lives. Um, and on the basis of that investigation, on the basis of those direct observations, we have to start uncovering or understanding what do I think, what have I accepted as true? What have I accepted as necessary? What am I familiar with? What kinds of tendencies and habits have I spent a lot of time and energy deepening and growing and cultivating? And is it time to critically reflect on all of that? And when I see that there are habits and tendencies and processes that are actually responsible for my suffering and are actually responsible for why I might give rise to suffering experiences to those in my environment, then how do I start to shift my way out of that? How do I start to move in a different direction? Um, and so this is a process, this is an ongoing, everyday process of becoming deeply aware of our minds and becoming deeply aware of our habits and our tendencies, and then trying to change. If we demonstrate to ourselves from our own direct experience that we are giving rise to our own suffering and we are causing suffering for others, well, then what new processes, what new habits, what new interpretations, what new stories can we start to become familiar with that will allow us to deepen our good qualities and then to work constructively for others. So this is, the whole next section that, um, that we're going to go into here, where this kind of laboratory of the mind is, tapping into our own potential when we move beyond the kind of false narrative of either indulgence or suppression being the only tools that are available to us, and we move into thinking about awareness and transformation, then we can start to see how we have, Venerable Robina, of course, always says, we're the boss. We're the ones who are in control of how much we want to take on board, how much we want to work with these ideas. But ultimately, this whole process is about looking inward and recognizing when things are not serving us, and then recognizing how new ways of thinking will start to allow us to tap into our potential. Any thoughts or questions or anything that people want to look more at? Yeah, so we'll just end with this last. So this is what, this is kind of the summation of all of that, is that Lama Yeshe is saying that our job, that the most useful thing that we can do is to try to dissect and understand our own inner experience. And that we shouldn't be following, that it isn't about following dogmatic rules or approaches. It's about developing introspective awareness and applying that in what is arising in our everyday lives, and then finding new ideas, new techniques, new processes for giving rise to things that don't cause us to suffer and don't cause us to and that don't motivate us to cause suffering for others. So that's the next kind of major section that we will be looking at. We'll be doing that next week. Any concluding thoughts or questions for today?
Venerable Dondrub, I
Yes.
was, it would be so wonderful if one had the magic potion that one could just dab onto those little wounds and let them just kind of be zapped away. But of course, the work has to be done by ourselves. So your comments have been very, very helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a slow and in this next section, of course, Lama Yeshe will go into working with expectation and working because it is such a long, as I think I've probably mentioned, my own way of working and thinking about it is I try to think of it in the same way that I try to think about physical. I try to think about mental health in the same way that I think about mental health, physical and mental health as being, which means that it's just, I can only sort of make incremental progress based on what I do every single day, and that it doesn't stop. I don't, I'm not ever at a place where I can start abusing my physical body, or, I can stop trying to think about what benefits the physical, because every single day, how you use that day brings you 24 hours closer to continuing to be in a state of balance and health, both with the body and also with the mind. So I just try to look at it like that, like, okay, I have another day, and so today I have to do all of the things that support a healthy body, and I have to do all of the things that support a healthy mind. And I have to do that again tomorrow, and I have to do that again the day after that. And it's just a day by day by day process that doesn't really ever have an end.
I think it can be a little bit um, difficult or complex when one is working in a situation. There's always at least two or three people. It could be a colleague or a sibling or someone that one knows really well. And let's say from the other side, there's no desire to change things, but from, let's say, our side, we wish to change. So I guess it would be a question of applying these methods in an abstract way that is a real way for us, while understanding that maybe the person on the other side does not necessarily want to change the parameter. So that can be a little bit, difficult.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, we'll look at that in more detail. Yeah, but ultimately, yes, we do have to. It may be, that the situation doesn't change, and so the only thing that's open to us is,
Hmm.
how does my mind that I'm bringing to the situation change? That may be
Right,
the only
right,
avenue that we have.
right. Thank you so much.
So we'll leave it there for today. So we'll just briefly have a sense of dedicating or offering our efforts, thinking that whatever positive energy we've created by contemplating in these ways, we just offer that for the benefit of all sentient beings without exception. And let me, in the chat, let me put in that. Yeah, so here's the link to the file for people who might want to download that. But then so we just offer the results of our efforts, not holding on to it, not allowing our practice to feed the ego, but just thinking whatever I've done, may it benefit all sentient beings without exception. And just having a sense of letting it go and offering it for the benefit of all. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.